So as we start this new CD, I hope you have a greater appreciation so far of the nonverbals that are all around us and some of the nonverbals that you may have been missing all along. One of the most important things about nonverbal behaviors is what it tells us about our need for space, our spatial needs, our personal needs for territory. Edward Hall, who was an anthropologist, began to do research in this area back in the 1940s, 1950s. And what he found was really rather striking, and it's something that we in Florida see every winter. In the wintertime, the birds flock down to Florida from up north, and when they sit on the electrical lines, they all sit equidistant to each other. And it's really quite remarkable as you're driving and you see thousands of these birds on these telephone wires and electrical wires, and you see them equidistantly spaced, almost like a ruler, and you say, why do they do that? It's only the rare ones that don't do that. And what Edward Hall found was that all animals have spatial needs. And he coined this proxemics. And proxemics has to do with our needs for space and every animal's needs for space. Throughout history, it's mankind's need for space and territory that have caused most wars. So obviously, space and territory are important to us, but not just on a national level. Look at your own space. Look at how you feel when somebody stands too close to you. Next time you're at the cash register and you're ready to check out, how do you feel when somebody's cart bumps you? Or think about you're sitting at work and somebody comes along and moves something personal of yours, be it a paper clip, a glass of water, a book that's on your desk. This is a violation of your space, of your territory. I've mentioned being at an ATM machine because this is where most of us get our money now, and someone gets too close to us and we feel the discomfort there. And what Edward Hall found was that all animals, including us, have needs for space. And we in particular, we humans, derive that need for space based on two things. One is social, and the other one is through our limbic system. Now, if you're hearing this and you were born in Latin America, or you grew up in New York City or in a major city on the East Coast, one of the things you find is that people tend to talk to each other closer together. If you go to the Middle East, if you go to South America, literally they are 5 to 12 to 15 inches away, very, very intimately spaced to you as they talk to you. And for us Americans, we find this intimacy, this closeness, very uncomfortable. In the same way that when you go to Latin America and you want to stand further away, they find that very uncomfortable, and they look at it as, why is this person so cold? Why do they have to stand so far away? This is social. And our spatial needs, our needs for space, are basically decided by our family. We sort of mirror what our parents did, what our older siblings did. But it can also be very personal. I have friends who have multiple brothers and sisters, and some of them like to stand close, and some of them not so much. So we have this social convention that tells us, well, if you're in Latin America, you stand this close. If you're in the Caribbean, you stand even closer. If you go to Norway and Sweden, not so much. If you go to England, you need more space. If you go to the Midwest and the West in the United States, you need more space. If you go to New York, you're going to stand closer. There's going to be, for instance, more touching as you speak. These spatial requirements we're very, very sensitive to. And what happens is whenever there's a violation of that space, we have limbic reactions, and usually they're negative. So if somebody violates our space, we will have a negative limbic reaction. We may turn towards that person. We may try to distance away from that person. We may scowl at that person or let them know that they're getting too close. We may try to distance ourselves in some way. And one of the easiest ways that I have found to deal with distance is obviously it's uncomfortable to ask somebody, where are you from? Do you need 12 inches, 8 inches, whatever? Because, in fact, one of the things that Edward Hall found is that we have our intimate space, which is from the skin to about 18 inches. And then we have our personal space, then social space, then public space. Well, you're not going to walk around life with a tape measure trying to figure these things out. The easiest way to do it is this. The first time you shake hands with someone, shake their hands and take a step back and watch what happens. Do they step forward towards you? Do they keep their place, or do they take a step back? If they take a step back, they need more space. If they remain where they're at, this is probably a good, comfortable distance to talk to each other from. If they move towards you, maybe they're from a part of the world, or maybe they feel better speaking closer to you. I'll never forget, years ago, I had a Cuban defector who I was debriefing, and we stood up to get some coffee. And when I turned around, I found him literally touching me. He was so close to me, but this is how he felt most comfortable. He didn't want to stand away from me. He wanted to be practically to where we could feel each other's breath. Now, that might make some people very, very uncomfortable. It made me somewhat uncomfortable, but I knew that this is what he needed. And at the moment, I needed the information that he harbored, so I was willing to put up with it. But again, it's a reminder that space is important to us. And when it's violated, and we can violate it by stepping into somebody's space, we can violate it by, for instance, touching someone. Many of you who are listening to this remember the picture of George Bush grabbing the Prime Minister of Germany, Merkel, by the shoulders, and you see her grimacing at this violation of space. He was joking around, and this just is something that she wasn't accustomed to, somebody violating her space in such a way. But there are different ways that we violate space. We can do it with our eyes, and oftentimes this makes women very uncomfortable, especially when men are ogling a woman, and we're looking at them from head to toe, back and forth, like a radar. This makes them feel very uncomfortable. This can make you feel like some sort of violation is taking place, and it is. It's a gaze violation, and it makes you feel extremely uncomfortable. We can also violate each other's space by touching the objects that belong to us. Somebody comes along and moves our stapler, or we have a picture of our spouse sitting in front of us and they move it over. The mere touching of those objects, which are considered within our space, have negative consequences, and so obviously are to be avoided. Our feet are important, our legs are important, and believe it or not, our hips are important. One of the things that we find in social research is that we often use our hips to reflect also how we feel about other people, especially in courtship behavior. When we're dating, you'll find individuals who care about each other, who are deeply involved with each other. You see a lot more of hip touching. The boy's hips will be touching the girl's hips, the man's hips, the women's hips, and so forth. And once more, this is truly indicative of their sentiments for each other. Obviously, individuals who are beginning to distance themselves from each other because of bad emotions or bad feelings for each other, you see less of the hip displays. Now, hip displays can also transmit information. For instance, we use it to be coquettish, to show sexual excitement, to show interest in other people. And you see more of the hips being displayed when we are in the sort of dating mode than you see later on in life. It's no accident that around the world, it's often the hips that are used in dance to demonstrate how excited we are or how we feel, or to follow the music. And so whether you're dancing ballroom, salsa, merengue, the rumba, notice how around the world we use the hips to show just how into this music we are. They're powerful indicators for us of emotion. And obviously, because the hips are associated with reproduction and genitalia and so forth, we often use the hips to demonstrate our sexual vitality, our sexual health, our interest in other people, and so forth. And so around the world, especially in courtship rituals, you see the adornment of the hips. You see hip displays in today's modern culture. You often see the low-riding jeans, which accentuate the hips. You see men who wear very tight pants to show just how virile they are and fit. Again, showing hip displays where you see the very defined male form with these kinds of clothes. So, in a sense, these are nonverbal displays. These are symbolic of how we view ourselves, and they're social. Obviously, the things that we see here in the United States and in the West may be quite different than what we see in the Middle East, where people, especially men and women, tend to be more covered, or certainly what we see in other parts of the world, where oftentimes both men and women, in fact, don't wear anything around their hips. They may just be barely covered as indicators of their health, their vitality, and their sexuality. One of the things that I often tell observers of nonverbal communication is not to dismiss hip behaviors, because oftentimes our hips will indicate a certain amount of discomfort. And you see it with people who are sitting down and they're hearing something they don't particularly like or care for, and you see them swiveling in their chair, or what you often see is individuals who are uncomfortable and they'll be shifting in their chair, moving around in their chairs, and their hips tend to be in this sort of agitated movement. These are indicators of discomfort. We should not dismiss these behaviors or merely associate them with, well, they're just not comfortable sitting. What in fact is usually the case is that they're very uncomfortable with the situation they're in, or what they're having to hear or to discuss. When we see people testifying, when we see people during job interviews, we tend to see a lot of hip displays of discomfort, the moving around, the shifting of weight on the hips, because this is a very good area of looking for this behavior. And obviously, at the opposite end, when we see people who are gregarious and happy and they're dancing and so forth, we see the extremes of hip movements, which obviously can be very pleasing and seductive. One of the truly powerful ways that we use our hips is what's called arms akimbo. And the best way to envision this is the way I envision how my mother used to greet me at the front door when I would come in late for dinner. She would be standing in the doorway with her hands on her hips and the elbows sticking out, looking at me, staring at me, not saying a word. And I knew in that instant that I was in trouble. Now, she wouldn't say anything, but this display, the hands on the hips, the arms way out, the elbows way out, this is called arms akimbo. And this is one of the ways that we have of demonstrating that there is an issue. Now, what's interesting is how this has changed over the years. When I started studying nonverbal behavior, I remember one commentator said, well, this is indicative of I'm ready. And there's been other ideas on what it really means, but I'm here to tell you that most of the time, when you see someone standing there with their hands on their hips, elbows out, their legs are slightly spread apart, this is a very territorial display. This is what we see when there's an issue. This is what we see when someone is in charge. when someone's in command. We see this a lot with law enforcement officers. We see this a lot with military personnel. This is how they like to stand. It's a very commanding presence. Now, this is a very useful behavior because universally it transmits that we may have a problem here, there's an issue here, or I'm in control here, or any number of things, power, issues, and so forth. But they also can have a very negative effect. Imagine if every time you came in to see your boss or your mom or your dad, they stood there with this stance of arms akimbo. This is a very negative stance. It can be very intimidating. And it can send the wrong message because, in essence, it's saying, I'm powerful and you're not. And so for a lot of people, it can be intimidating. And in fact, in working with law enforcement officers, I often say this is one of the worst behaviors that you can do when you respond to a domestic call. Because when you get to that house and you have the husband and the wife and they're screaming and yelling at each other and you stand in that doorway and you stand arms akimbo, you're blocking the doorway, you're claiming a lot of territory with this display, and the message that you're sending is, I'm in charge and this is my house. And it can actually make the situation much worse. In the same vein, I've often had to talk to female police officers, and females normally don't tend to stand arms akimbo and say, look, you may be confronted with a drunk, or you may be confronted by two people who maybe don't care for you. And one of the ways to show that you are authoritarian, that you're in charge of the situation, is not to stand there with your hand on your baton or your hands in your pockets, but rather to place your hands on your hips, elbows out, and demonstrate this very territorial display that lets them know that they're going to have to deal with you. So it has its place. Now, what's interesting about arms akimbo is that there are several ways of doing it. And one of the ways that we most often do it is with the thumbs back. So the thumbs are actually pointed towards our backside and our pinkies are pointed forward. That's usually how you see it. And that tends to say there's an issue here. Now, here's what's interesting, and I tell this to people that deal with human resources or with clinicians. One of the ways that we can change this is you can have arms akimbo, but change the position of the hands so that as they come to rest on your hips, the thumbs are forward and the fingers are facing back. And what that does is it changes the impression. And we've done studies when people see this, and what it does is make you look inquisitive rather than intrusive. So by merely rotating the thumbs forward and putting your hands on your hips and maybe not holding your elbows out so wide, you look more inquisitive. You're wondering what's going on versus when we put it with our thumbs back, fingers forward, where we look like, what's going on here? I'm in charge and you're going to have to deal with me. So here's a way that we use our hips, our hands and our elbows, obviously our arms, to create a larger perception of ourselves, to create a larger figure which is noticeable at quite a distance. I mean, you can be a block away from somebody, and as you're walking towards them, if they're standing there arms akimbo, I assure you, they've got an issue with you and they want to talk about it. So be mindful of this because it's a powerful display. It can be used very positively as a leader where you're trying to emphasize a point. You often see this with football coaches as they're talking to their troops, as they're talking to their athletes, getting them ready to march into the game. And you certainly see it with military officials. And you can do it as a CEO, as you're getting your people charged up for a big sales or whatever. But it can also be very negative, especially when we use it with children, people who are sensitive, or in human resource. So we want to attenuate that. We want to minimize those things because we want people to talk to us. And once again, I can still always remember my mom meeting me at the door, and I know she didn't want to talk too much. She just wanted to let me know that I was running late for dinner. Like so many other parts of our bodies, the hips are really remarkable in the way we use them to communicate. This is where we put our belts, and some of the belts can be small, large, flashy, interesting. I was just in Arizona the other day, and there was a cowboy there with a large belt buckle, very interesting, handcrafted, obviously silver. And you realize that around the world, oftentimes it's around our waist and hips where we put these articles of clothing and attire, these accoutrements of society which transmit information about who we are, what our professions are, and so forth. One of the things that researchers in nonverbal communications have found is how we use the hips to communicate things such as sexual interest. We refer to this as genital framing. And what you often see is, particularly with men, but I've also seen it with a lot of women, where they will tuck their thumbs into their belt or into their pants so that the fingers are dangling on the outside, spaced equidistant on either side of the zipper, literally framing the genitals. And what researchers say, and it's fairly accurate, is this. We often use genital framing to demonstrate to the people that we're interested in that what I want you to think about me right now is me as a sexual person, me as someone that you can consider as part of the general scheme here of dating and so forth. And we do this not by saying, hey, excuse me, listen, look at me. But we do it by placing our hands in the area of the hips in such a way that we frame the genitals. And in essence, we're saying, look at me. I'm young, I am virile, and I may be of interest to you. And where do you see that? Go to any country western dance. And I've been to a few when I was living in Arizona, and you certainly see this behavior there. But you see it around the world anytime young people are around each other. And it's a way of focusing attention on our reproductive organs. I just thought I'd share that with you because sometimes we see behaviors, we're not sure what they mean. We wonder, well, why do they do something like that? And obviously, this is something that is significant to us as a species. I'd like to talk now about our torso because here's one area that is often neglected when we talk about nonverbal communications. And yet our torsos say a lot about us, but they do so in a way that maybe we haven't thought about. So as you're listening to this, I want you to look around and I want you to look at other people's torsos, and if there's no one around, and look at yourself. One of the things that you will immediately reflect upon is that your torso will reflect how healthy you are. Now, that is communicating something. So one of the things that the torso reflects is an indicator of our age. It's an indicator of our health. And obviously, the ideal is to look like the statue of David, where you have broad shoulders, narrow hips, and you have a rippled, well-defined six-pack, and so forth. Well, a few of us look like that. But obviously, the torso is a powerful transmitter of our health, of how we present to the world. And in fact, Roman armament, when we look at the equipment that Roman soldiers would wear, was designed to accentuate how we looked so that we looked more like a V shape, so that we looked more threatening, so that we looked more fit. And the same goes for women, is the torso reflects our youth, it reflects whether or not we're healthy, it also reflects whether or not we're pregnant. Now, I bring this up because when we think about nonverbal communications, most of us just think of, well, what does the hands say? What do the eyes say? But when we, as professionals, when we look at nonverbals, we have to look at the torso. And I always look at the torso as our human billboard. This is the billboard that tells the world so many things about us, even when we're just sitting down watching television, or we're just laying on the couch, as I often tend to do on a weekend, having traveled all week long. It says so much about our fitness. It says so much about our health. The way we decorate our torso. And this is in part why I refer to it as the human billboard, is because, first of all, we have what's called an orientation reflex. And this is something we share with other mammals. And this orientation reflex takes our eyes off of anything that doesn't move and makes us focus on any movement, which is often why we're distracted. But our torso, because it really doesn't move, we have arms and we have legs, but there's nothing really moving on our torso, we're often distracted from that. So in all societies, one of the things that we find is that the torso is used for decoration. This is where primitive man would paint lines and symbols and dots. This is where scarification takes place. Even today, there are societies that will scar the skin on the torso as an indicator of strength and virility. This is where we clothe ourselves so that we can have what's called the peacock effect, so that you will notice me. And this is why we get dressed up. This is why we wear the tuxedo. It's not because of the arms, and it's not because of the legs. It's because of the torso. So we see that nice white shirt on Mr. Clooney. He always looks good in a tuxedo, and he's got the cummerbund, which makes his waist look thin, and we have this beautiful ventral display across the torso. So we put ornaments on ourselves. We put jewelry across the torso. We wear the fine shirt with the signature logo. We wear different things on our torso because this is our living signpost that says, look at me. Look at me, because this is representative of my availability for dating, for marriage, for childbearing, or it's indicative of my social status. I can't tell you how many people I've run into that have a polo shirt or any number of other designers who place their design on the shirt to show that this is not a $12.95 shirt. This is a $70, $80, $100, $200 shirt for you to be impressed with. This is a very expensive dress. They just had the Golden Globe Awards, and as people were filing out, they were being asked, what are you wearing? Well, most of them had nothing on their arms, and most of them had nothing on their legs. It was just covering their torso. And why is this so important? Because when we look at haute couture, when we look at high fashion, what we're really looking at is that which covers the torso. And that seems to be supremely important to all of us. And as we go around the world and you look at different cultures, it's those things, the accoutrements, the things that we drape ourselves with, clothe ourselves with, and wrap around ourselves, our torso, are indicative of our social status, where we stand, and so forth. I find it interesting from a historical standpoint that when the conquistadores arrived in the New World and they looked at and dealt with the kings that were here, the ethnographers that were on that trip reported back that they saw the same thing that they had just seen in Spain, where the royalty was dressed better, clothed better, was more ornate than the rest of the population. And so even though the clothing was slightly different than what you saw between Queen Isabella's court and that in the New World, it in fact wasn't that much more different. It was still intricate, it was still ornate, it was still more special than what other people wore. and it was all centered around the torso of the body. Which is why I think it's useful for us to think about how we use our torso to communicate to the world around us. And I say that both as a father, because I've seen the way that young people dress at times, where maybe they're revealing too much or not enough. And I've also seen it as a business person when people are going in and applying for a job and they don't think that it matters how they're dressed. Well, it all matters. And it either shows that you care or you don't care, that you're conventional or unconventional. But one of the things that's definitely true is we look for the torso to act as a window as to who is this individual and what do they represent. And so here's one place where we can gather nonverbal information as to what's going on in this individual's head. And obviously, one of the things that clinicians look for is when people are healthy, when people are well, they tend to take care of themselves. Just like with animals. When the bird or the dog begins to not care about its feathers and begins to not care about its coat, the same thing happens to us. When we don't take care of our torso, clinicians can look at that and say, okay, there are some problems here because this is something that's very important to us as a species, and when we don't take care of ourselves, we don't take care of our health or how we present, then this is an indication of maybe a pathology that's taking place here with this individual. One of the interesting things that I often do in my lectures is I look at my audience and I say, how many of you were dressed by your parents today? And obviously these are men and women, and they all get a little chuckle. And then I say, well, that's interesting. So none of you were dressed by your parents. So you chose to dress and look the way you did today all by yourself. And that's when the laughter really sets in. And that's when you realize that how we adorn this wonderful torso that we have, how we dress, how we project is really based on our personalities. It's really based on how we feel about ourselves, how we think about ourselves. The person that's on his way up the ladder is going to be dressing differently than the person who this is a job. They don't care. And it's oftentimes a very accurate reflection of how this individual see themselves. So I tell people all the time, it doesn't matter what part of industry they're in, whether they've already made it or not. The question is, ask yourself, for what I do each day, does it matter how I dress this torso? And if it matters, and it's not if it matters to you, here's the key. If it matters to the owner of the company, if it matters to the CEO, if it matters to the organization, then this is one of the things that you need to think about and say, how am I going to dress? How am I going to adorn this body to enhance this experience, to make me more successful? Another interesting facet about our torso is that we demonstrate, in many ways, our honesty. People perceive us as more honest when they can see our torso. And this is why you often see politicians. Politicians will not wear a 3-button business suit. Politicians wear a 2-button business suit. And the reason they do that is a 2-button suit buttons much lower, and so you have a larger ventral front display, which is perceived as being more honest than individuals who wear 3-button suits, which button very high and block more of the torso or chest area. In fact, if you go through history and you look at political leaders and you look at people that have been evil, when you look at Stalin, when you look at Hitler, when you look at Fidel Castro, when you look at Chairman Mao, when you look at Yasser Arafat, when you look at all these characters that, for whatever the reason, have been associated with some kind of antisocial behavior, what do you usually see? That you don't see ventral displays. In fact, their clothing shows them being closed off to the world, wearing clothing that doesn't reveal the front part of their chest. And this is part of the perception that they want to generate, that they are distant from us, that they are occluded from us, they're different from us, that they're not accessible. And so they oftentimes dress to reflect this precise pathology that we have. And of course, in the movies, when you think of Dr. No, whether you remember it in the original film with James Bond or you saw it in some other form as a spoof on Dr. No, you see this very evil person dressed with this tunic that prevents you from looking at the ventral display. So this is something that's universal. I often tell prosecutors that when you're dealing with juries, to make sure that they can see you, to make sure that you wear a 2-button suit so that you have a very large ventral display. Politically, Massachusetts Governor Romney had his suit specially tailored for this so that his buttons were very low, and so you had this large ventral area, which has always been perceived as very honest. One of the questions that I'm often asked is, well, what does it mean when you put things across your torso, like when you cross your arms across your torso? I've heard it said that that means you're closed off or you're unapproachable and so forth. So I thought I would clarify a few things relating to that. It is true that oftentimes when we are insecure or we are uncomfortable, we'll put things across our torso. And I often see this at the university where I teach, where young people, as they're coming into the classroom for the first time, outside the classroom, they were carrying their books in their hands. But when they come into the classroom, they'll take their books and or their purse and they'll put it across their chest and so forth. And yes, this in fact is a barrier. We often see it in courtship behavior. A woman is sitting at a restaurant or at a bar, she's waiting for a friend, and someone comes and sits next to her that she doesn't particularly care for or doesn't want to talk to. And one of the things that she may do is pick up her purse and place it in her lap so that it rests up against her torso. These are in fact blocking behaviors. They're very useful to us. Most of the time, though, when you see people, for instance, sitting in a classroom or listening to a speaker, and they have their arms crossed in front of them, this may be just a very comfortable way for them to sit. It's a very enjoyable way. It may be the way that they choose to sit at that particular moment. It has nothing associated with anything negative. It's just there's a preference for it. One of the things that I tell students of nonverbal behaviors to look for is look for when people are talking to each other and their arms are crossed, but they're gripping their arms very tightly. A very tight grip when you have, in fact, your arms crossed is usually indicative of something very negative, and people that are angry will come across that way. Or they may puff out their chest and cross their arms, indicative of there's some real issues here and so forth. But for the most part, no, it's not to be associated with something negative. What I do find interesting is, in studying people, is that for the most part, when we're at home by ourselves, we don't cross our arms in front of us. In fact, we rarely do that when we're at home. We'll do other things, but we don't really cross our arms and watch TV that way. And I think this has to do with social convention, and that is that when we are in a social setting where there's strangers or other people, even those that we know and they're around us, that we derive a certain amount of comfort in putting our hands across our chest. And so at a minimum, I would look at it as a comforting display. This provides us some comfort. And then if we see the tightening of the hands as they grip their arms, or if there's a puffing out of the chest, then it's potentially a discomfort display. Now, one of the interesting things about our torso is how we use it to let people know that we like them or don't like them. And in this area, as I said, the front of the chest, this is our ventral side. And of course, our back side is our dorsal. So you have the ventral side and dorsal side of our bodies. When we talk about dolphins, we talk about the dorsal fin on the back. But for us, for humans, we do something that's really quite peculiar, and I coined it ventral fronting and ventral denial. When we like people, when we like something, we tend to turn towards them. We tend to ventrally front towards that person. We give them access so that they can read the front of our chest and so forth, our ventral side. But the minute something takes place that is disagreeable to us, we engage what's called ventral denial. And of course, the extreme of that is when you turn your back on somebody. And you say, well, he turned his back on me, he walked away. That's the extreme form of ventral denial. So with a couple, as they're talking to each other and as things are taking place, all of a sudden you can go from ventral fronting where everything is fine to all of a sudden the person turns away and there's ventral denial. And I'll tell you, it doesn't have to take place between adults. An example of this, the other day I'm at a playground where I usually warm up before I go for my run. And I'm watching a little girl and her mother, and the mother says, well, we have to be leaving soon. And the little child all of a sudden crossed her arms in front of her, tightly gripped herself, and immediately turned away. So here we have a cluster of behaviors, very indicative of something negative. She wanted to stay there with her friend, and so she blocked her mother by crossing her arms and then ventrally denied her. Now, this child couldn't have been more than 4 years old. Where she learned this behavior, I'm not sure. I suspect most of it is innate. But in one instant, she communicated to her mother exactly how she felt about leaving, and she did it using her torso to communicate that information more powerfully than any words that she could have uttered. One of the lasting memories that I have of ventral fronting and ventral denial is the last few months of the marriage of Princess Di and Prince Charles, as they would drive around London in their limousine, and they would sit there both staring straight ahead or away from each other, but never allowing each other to ventrally front towards each other. This is a good reminder that when we care about individuals, when we feel comfortable around them, we turn towards them, we face them, we allow them to see the full front of our torsos. And when we don't, when there are negative sentiments, and they could be passing or they could be permanent, we definitely use our ventral denial abilities to communicate that we are not comfortable with these individuals. While talking about the torso, I want to mention a few things here which I think are important for young people and for established professionals. One of the things that I found while conducting jury surveys was that your average jury, and we used to structure these composed of people in their late teens, 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. So spanning 7, 8 generations, one of the things we found was that the exposure of skin, of flesh, is never appreciated. And I say that because if you're wearing too low of a dress or a blouse that's too open, or your tummy is showing in a professional setting, that just does not sit well. Now, it may look well on the pages of magazines, and if you are a rock star, or if you're a music star, or if you're an actress, you can probably get away with things like that. But in the real world, in a professional world, in the business world, we can definitively say from the research and empirically that when we ask people to look at these individuals, how they're dressed, they're always ranked very low. And in fact, they're often ignored as far as what they have to say and what they can bring to the table when there are too many displays of flesh. And for men, one of the things that we find in torso displays is men who wear too much jewelry that can be seen. Men who wear their shirts open and who have chains around their necks and so forth. What we find from working with juries and from focus groups is that these are often associated with antisocial behavior. They're often associated with negative sentiments. And so we have to be respectful of that, because obviously in business, what we're trying to do is fit in. And if on average these send out negative signals, then we want to avoid them. And that also goes for somewhat of a new phenomena, is that excessive tattooing of both the male torso and the female torso. And I can tell you this from the research and from empirical evidence, and that is that if you are in the medical business, if you are in finance, if you're in any kind of business that deals with trust or with anything related to food and food production and so forth, you should avoid any tattoos that are visible, and not just in the torso, but visible anywhere. And while this may change, and at some future point, as with everything else, I still remember in the 60s when long hair was perceived as some sort of national threat. But what the research does tell us, at least in the present time, tattoos are perceived very negatively, and if you're in one of those industries where there's a high degree of trust, medicine, food, or finance, if you have tattoos, make sure they're hidden and they're not on display. Since we're talking about the torso, I have to at this point obviously talk about the shoulders. The shoulders are rarely talked about in the literature of nonverbal communications. I'm not sure why, but I have to tell you, in my world, in the world that I came from, in the world of counterintelligence, shoulders spoke to us a tremendous amount of information which we found to be very useful. Ever notice when someone is asked a question and one of the shoulders comes up towards the ear and they say, "I don't know"? Now, think about that and think about the person who is asked a question and they say, "I don't know," but both shoulders come up to the ears, their palm up, and they say, "I don't know." And one of the things that we found in conducting investigations over a 25-year period was people who only used half of their shoulders, whose only one half of the shoulder would rise up, we found to be less credible than when both of the shoulders came up. And in part we think, and there's not a lot of science behind this, but it certainly was observed, we think it's because emotionally, limbically, they're not committed to this, what they're saying. So it was very difficult for them to bring their shoulders up both at one time, and so only half of it takes place. And this begins to give you a clue into how does this person really feel about what they're saying. Another thing we found with the shoulders was how often people who lack confidence would not allow their shoulders to hang down. In other words, people who lack confidence tend to elevate their shoulders towards their ears. And we started calling this the turtle effect, where their head was seemingly starting to be hidden by their rising shoulders, almost making their necks disappear as they lack confidence. And especially we found this with people when they were making what we call a formal declarative statement, where they would say, "I did not shoot so-and-so." And we found there was a big difference between the person whose shoulders were straight down and claiming a lot of territory versus a person whose shoulders would come towards their ears, whose head would sink down, their necks would disappear, and they would say, "I did not kill so-and-so." The mere hunching up of the shoulders was very much indicative to us of a lack of confidence. Now, not necessarily deception, but lack of confidence in what they were saying. So we would look for this behavior to indicate to us that there was something missing there, that the emotion attached to what was being said was not as strong. So as we come to the end of this section, you're probably telling yourself, my goodness, I didn't know that our hips, our torso, and our shoulders had so much information there for us. Well, in fact, they do. And as we summarize, we know that the hips can communicate to us happiness, and that's what we see in dancing, or they can communicate to us displeasure. Our torso, which is in a way our living billboard, can communicate a lot to the world about our health, what we're thinking, what we're feeling, even our social status, and so forth. And our shoulders can communicate quite a bit of information about how strongly we feel about different things. So one of the things that I want you to remember when you look at other people is I want you to begin to see the total person. Not just the face, not just the feet, not just the eyes, but the total body. What is it all communicating to me? Previously we talked about the legs and the feet, but now I want you to join that up with the hips, the torso and the shoulders, and ask yourself, what are all these areas of the body communicating to me? And put that in context to help you decipher, interpret, and to communicate.